Thanks a lot. Merci. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Politico's Competitive Europe Summit. My name is Giorgio Leali. I am a reporter with Politico, and I'm very happy today to moderate this session about state aid. First of all, just for your questions, we'll be able to ask questions, but you will have to use the swap card application, so you can use your mobile or your laptop to do so. And I will briefly introduce my very distinguished panelists. But in a second. Before doing that, I will just tell you what we're going to discuss. So we will focus on whether those big changes that we have seen in state aid policy are there to stay. So we have seen when the COVID pandemic started, we had the first temporary framework coming into force, and then we saw these rules being extended over and over, then with the war in Ukraine, and now in a more permanent way. So we will ask ourselves how these changes are going to affect the European Union state aid policy. So to discuss this topic, we have with us today Ben Smulders, who is Deputy Director General for State Aid at the European Commission, at the Director General for Competition, DG Comp. We also have Fabienne Zuleg, who is Chief Executive of the European Policy Center. And we have online, he will join us briefly, Mario Monti, former Prime Minister of Italy, who also served as both Commission and Internal Market Commissioner. So he has been a Competition and Internal Market Commissioner in the past. So we are ready to start. So please join us on stage. Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's start directly with the first question for you, Mr. Smulders. Yeah, if you're okay with it. The question that we're all asking ourselves is whether these changes that we have seen in state aid rules are here to stay. So how permanent is this shift that we are witnessing?
I think the succession of temporary rules has been a response to an unexpected succession of corresponding crises. And that doesn't make the rules permanent, although I see that the optics may suggest otherwise. In fact, the Commission has always been clear on the fact that there are specific responses to specific crises. And indeed, we have modified these temporary frameworks as the crisis situation evolves, letting some measures lapse. Sorry, thank you very much. Letting some measures lapse and adding other ones. We have done so on the basis of very close monitoring of market developments and also in close consultation with member states. If you take, for instance, the temporary COVID framework, we have had 8 versions between 19th of March 2020 and the 7th of November 2022. The temporary crisis framework, which was adopted in March of last year, was, because of that monitoring, amended twice. And then we have, as latest deliverable, the TCTF of the 9th of March of 2023. And there we have clearly specified that most measures will expire at the end of this year, with some possibilities of conversion until the end of 2024, except the net zero transition sections, which will last until the end of 2025. So it is a movement, but it doesn't mean it's permanent.
Just before moving to the next question, if I may follow up on this, there are some changes like in thresholds, in notification thresholds, for example, when it comes to specific sectors. Do you think that those kind of changes, on the contrary, could be permanent, so less aid will be notified in the future?
True. Last Friday, we adopted a revision, quite a fundamental revision of the group block exemption regulation, as it is called. And that is more than a crisis measure. That is there to stay for a while. To modify a group block exemption regulation, well, that takes time. And we are not going to do that every week or every month as crises evolve.
Thank you. And I'd like maybe now to focus on the consequences of this changed in rules. And I see that Mario Monti has joined us. So I would like to maybe ask you a question. I remember when the pandemic started, we had a chat and you told us that it would be very, very hard to go back to how rules were before, to go back to the traditional state aid regime. So I was wondering whether you see a risk in these relaxed state aid rules, and whether you see countries with deeper pockets spending more and having a risk of fragmentation of the internal market. Professor Monti.
Well, thank you very much. Delighted to be here. I hope the connection works. I fully understand that Europe needs to pay much greater attention than in the past to the geopolitical dimension, and also that it should seek a higher strategic autonomy. All this is very good, and I think that Ben Smulders has already indicated some instruments that the Commission has deployed in its communication on economic security. My big concern, however, is when ample use is made or is announced to be made in the future of state aid control relaxation, because we have seen the asymmetries that can be created if this takes place. Of course, those countries which have or believe that they have a sounder tax position or a higher fiscal space will be more generous in disbursement or in promising at least state aids to their companies. This, of course, creates a worse level playing field than the single market is expected to provide, and is definitely a backward move, both from the point of view of the parity of conditions among member states, but also from the point of view of allocation of resources across the single market. And a danger I wish to warn against is that if Europe's way to react to the USSIRA or to acquire a better competitive position vis-à-vis China, for example, is through the state aids, then this means that as we work to prepare new strategic assets for the geopolitical era, we perhaps undermine one of the very few strategic assets in the real sense that Europe has been putting in place since 30 years, that is the single market, which is recognized across the world to be one of the very few serious and tough things that Europe has to play with in the global economy, such as well as trade policy or monetary policy, those aspects which have been time ago conferred to the European Union from member states. So I conclude, let's be very careful, because it would be puzzling but deeply disappointing and historically a big negative if we were to try to improve the strategic position of Europe by dismantling one of our strategic assets. And if we did so, it would be like saying to the US on one side, China on the other, okay, in order to be better equipped to compete with you, we Europeans undermine one of our strengths. So the outcome of this would be, if we can use a Latin expression, come in, and come on, Americans and Chinese, divide et impera. We leave you more space to undermine our single market. As a matter of fact, we do that ourselves. And if you find a Europe that is internally more divided, then you can rule us better. This is a pessimistic view, but I think it is important to warn all of us against this scenario, especially at a time when I hope I'm too pessimistic now, when the common ground between our two largest member states, Germany and France, seems to be at present not much else than a policy of largesse concerning state aid.
Today, and I was wondering whether what you just said, is it pessimism or is it reality already? So I wanted to ask to you, Mr. Zuleg, whether you see already this single market fragmentation risk being really real there, or is it more like a signal that the European Commission was meant to send? Because if we see the amount that were notified and the amount of state aid that was actually spent, we see that it's only a small fraction. It was around 14% according to latest numbers, but Mr. Smulders will correct me if I'm wrong. So I was wondering, is this a signal that is sent to businesses and to countries? Is it like whatever it takes in the state aid domain?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me, and also thank you for the previous introductory words. Unfortunately, I think I'm a little bit more pessimistic than Mario Monti, because I think if we are not going to address the challenges which we're facing today, we're going to end up with the worst of all worlds. And for that, I think we have to understand that the big picture has radically changed. We live in a very different world. The question I would ask everyone is, have we experienced a Zeitenwende? Have we experienced a new era? If we have, which I believe we have, then the policy prescriptions which we have had in the past, at the very least, need to be re-examined. We need to look at those and see, are they able to address the challenges we are facing today? And those challenges are enormous. First, I would start with what we've called the perma-crisis. So in a sense, it's a response to, are these measures going to be permanent? Well, they are addressing crisis, but if we are in a perma-crisis, we are also going to need measures which can permanently address that. Maybe not those measures, but we will need measures which can permanently address that. And the perma-crisis is nowhere near over. It is going to continue. The challenges are already there. We live in a much more challenging global environment. We're seeing essentially the death of multilateralism. We're seeing my country first. We're seeing very strategic and long-term industrial policy being pursued by a number of countries where Europe is going to lose out. The second big change which we are facing are major fundamental transformations, systemic transformations, which need to change our economy and our society. Clearly, climate change, sustainability is there. The technological revolution we are facing globally, which is accelerating rather than slowing down. I would add to that for Europe, demography, which is something which we are underestimating quite dangerously at the moment. And now the fourth one, with the watershed moment of the war against Ukraine, that we have to be much more serious about economic security. All of these will have costs, they will have trade-offs, they will make difficult choices. Even if we only look at the amount of investment which is going to be needed in these four areas, we're talking about trillions. This is enormous in terms of the challenge which we're facing. Some of that will have to come from the public purse. Yes, the main investment will have to come from the private sector, but we also will have to find different ways of spending public money. So in light of all of these challenges and the watershed moment of Russia's invasion, I think we are going to see much greater intervention of countries in their economies, not just in Europe, around the world. And what that means is, fundamentally, I think the risk we are facing now is that governments, national governments in Europe, are going to respond to these challenges. And unless we find a way of doing that in common at the European level, we are going to see a creeping renationalization, and I think we are starting to see the signs of that already.
Thank you. That's really, it really goes to the point. Yes, please, if you'd like to add something.
I think we had just heard a lot of wisdom. And to start with what Mr. Zulek just said, yes, we are perhaps in a permanent crisis situation, but the crises are of different natures. And that is why our crisis rules have been constantly being adapted and trying to be as proportionate and limited to what really was necessary to address them, and therefore subject to multiple changes. But there was a much more general message which you conveyed, and indeed we are living in a very, very unstable world where the EU is exposed to many threats from outside, and the natural inclination of member states, if the EU doesn't take the lead, is to take unilateral action, and that is of course very, very damaging if that occurs. And that brings me to the wise words of Mario Monti, who it's for me totally impossible to contradict him, because he has always been my master, and so that and I'm not going to do that also out of conviction, not only out of respect. We take that. I think it is absolutely crucial that we always remind ourselves that, first of all, long-term competitiveness cannot be based on state aid only. Yes, we are facing huge transformations. Yes, there are formidable market failures to be addressed, which justify state aid, sometimes substantial amounts of aid. But again, there needs to be central control in the common interest. The counterfactual to state aid control is that there would be no counterweight to the individual member states' fiscal firepower, not the opposite. So basic principles of state aid control, such as necessity and proportionality, serve to keep the deep pockets problem, to which Mario referred, in check, as do a number of specific compatibility conditions that we upheld through the crisis. Limited amounts, a preference for schemes over individual aid, etc. I'm not going into the details. That needs to be kept in mind. But we have been clear from the outset that the integrity of the internal market at large would call for funding instruments also at EU level. And the initiative, which was launched last week on strategic technologies for Europe platforms, the so-called STEP initiative, is exactly seeking to reinforce, leverage and steer EU funds, not national funds, to investments in deep and digital, clean and biotechnologies in the EU, with a special emphasis on assisted regions within the EU. So that is at least the policy orientation. Just also to nuance, but in no way I want to diminish the risk signaled by both speakers. But let's have a look at the figures. We have looked at normal state aid, so outside the crisis frameworks, and we have seen that there are no significant changes compared to the pre-crisis situation in terms of spending patterns. Then with respect to the COVID temporary framework, we have observed an overall correlation between GDP losses as a result of the COVID crisis and aid actually granted to individual member states. So that, with all the caveats and provisos, seems to suggest that there was not a clear tendency towards overcompensation. And then if we look at the energy crisis since March of last year, well, it started a little bit earlier, there we also can see a certain correlation between the amounts of the aid spent and the member states' energy sensitivity to the Ukraine war. Eurostat has developed a methodology to measure that sensitivity. And this is particularly true for Germany, but it's also true that other member states, which were also considerably sensitive to the Ukraine war and the consequences for its energy, granted less aid. That said, the big state aid measures granted by Germany relate to Uniper and Safer, and allowing those companies to collapse would have triggered probably systemic risks affecting the whole of the society, industry, the public sector, and citizens alike. So
thank you.
I would...
That's very clear, and thanks a lot for adding this context, because it shows that, of course, this is not an unreasoned reaction the Commission is having, but it's a very proportionate approach with very strict controls against overcompensation. So that is the objective. And you mentioned a key topic that we will discuss later, so how we can compensate this difference in spending power between member countries, so the European Sovereignty Fund. But just before moving to that, can I ask you a question, just a very short answer, on precisely on the criteria that are overseeing state aid control, so how the Commission justifies state aid decisions. We are seeing some court challenges that are being successful. We have seen in May the General Court in the Lufthansa case. Do you think that the temporary framework is a great tool, but at the same time there are some legal risks associated to it? Commissioner Vestager a few minutes ago said that it's always good to have guidance from court because then the Commission can learn and do better for the future. But do you expect more cases like this one to come out? If you could give us a short answer on this before.
Yes, no. More than 1,000 decisions have been taken under the COVID temporary framework. So far, quite a few have been challenged before the court. And the fact that that is possible before an effective and independent judiciary is a great good. So far, only one has been annulled on substantive ground, and that is Lufthansa. Perhaps others will follow, but in proportion to the number of cases, that is, of course, relatively little, and it would suggest that the way we apply the state aid rules in specific cases can meet the scrutiny of the courts. And again, I think we should only be grateful that there is such a judicial instance in Luxembourg vetting us scrupulously. So, and it gives guidance, as Margarethe has just said. And we, on the basis of course, of the case law, we adjust our policy and our individual enforcement.
Thank you very much for your very clear answer. There is another topic that we have already mentioned a couple of times. So, how can the European Commission, the European Union, try to address this risk of fragmentation of the single market? And there were a lot of expectations around the European Sovereignty Fund. And we saw last week we had something different, the Strategic Technologies for Europe platform. STEP is the acronym that we can use to refer to this new tool that the Commission has proposed. So I would like to ask to both of you, Mr. Zuleg and Professor Monti, what do you make of this new tool? Were you disappointed when you saw that this new tool was funded with existing funds and was not the big thing that many were expecting from President von der Leyen's speech? Maybe I would start with you, Mr. Zuleg, on this, please.
Sure. I think firstly, it is very good that we're seeing a recognition also at the European level of the transformations which we have to go through, not only in the sustainability field, but also in other areas such as technology, such as economic security. So in that sense, I would say it's positive that we're seeing it. And I don't have a particular problem with STEP itself. I think it looks like it follows on from some similar programs we've had in the past, with the idea of leveraging investment, which I think can produce some good results. I'm a little bit lukewarm because I think that what we have there is nowhere near what we actually would need to decisively address the transformations which we are facing. We've called this the European progress illusion, that if we are looking at the scale and the scope of the challenges we are facing, then we are still trying to address exponential challenges with linear policy. And that's not going to work in the long run. So I think this is a positive step, but it certainly isn't a European sovereignty fund. It certainly isn't going to address the fundamental challenge, I think, which we have in the technology field, that Europe has fallen behind in many of the key enabling technologies which are going to be crucial, not only for competitiveness, but also for security, for a number of other challenges which we are facing. And very often when we have these discussions, the aim seems to be at the European level, well, let's try not to fall behind much further, let's try to keep up, whereas what I think our ambition should be is to be at the forefront of these developments, to be leading on these developments, to be also globally competitive when it comes to these key enabling technologies. And I think a much more decisive European sovereignty fund could have helped us moving in that direction. But that will then require, and it has already been mentioned, it requires funds at the European level. Essentially what we need is a common industrial policy which also looks at technology, which looks at investment, which looks at the long term. And at this moment in time, member states don't seem to be willing to go in that direction. And that still carries the danger. And I would emphasize that again. I think we are seeing that a number of countries are doing these investments, are doing these policy changes at the national level because they don't see it happening at the European level. They are also the ones who are actually preventing it at the European level. But what we then end up with is the fragmentation. And I think we should recall that the single market in the end is a common set of rules. It's a common way of doing things. That's the essence of the single market. And I think that is being undermined already.
Thank you very much. Professor Monti, I'd also like to ask you about this. Do you think that, so it's again about member states. Are member states preventing the European Commission from coming with a bigger proposal, with a true European sovereignty fund? And do you think that, again, some member states, you mentioned a couple of them before, would like to keep in their hands the competitive advantage that they have, the deeper pockets that they do have? So is it really this that is preventing the European Union from moving faster on this fund?
Well, I think we need keep very much in mind the broad picture here. As Fabian Sulek said already in his previous intervention, we are witnessing and we are going to see for the future, for some time as well, a greater role for the public powers, for the public sector relative to the market in the management of our overall economies. This is in sharp difference relative to the Reagan, Thatcher, and after that period. That is clear. Except that in the case of Europe, what do we mean by public power relative to the market? Do we mean public power at the national level or public power at the EU level? And I think this is a strictly crucial point, because I believe that the only way that Europe has to come out fortified rather than disintegrating from this more geopolitical and geostrategic era is if the reaction in the internal allocation of powers within the European Union goes a bit more in the sense of the Union and a bit less in the sense of member states. Whereas I believe that in many areas, and it is well possible to devolve competences to member states, Ben Smulders and others will remember very well the devolution to member states that the reform of competition instruments, so-called modernization, implied in 2004, much less for Brussels, much more for the national competition authorities. But Brussels was able, in the area of competition, to be much more solid and stronger in dealing with the big international cases. Okay, now in the current situation, the risk is that whatever greater role for the public is required and will come through relative to the market, be vested into the national, not into the supranational, because and the perfect example is what would happen if the trend towards greater flexibility in state aid by national governments was to be granted as a permanent feature, because in that case, we would have a Europe which not only is governed more by public power relative to the market, which is perhaps appropriate in the coming years, but that public power would be fragmented. Not only the market would become fragmented. And I think it's interesting to note that, for example, in the case of state aid themselves, we are seeing an inverse trend here, because the aid to companies in the US has traditionally been granted very, very much by the states, not by the federal government. With IRA, President Biden has proceeded to a greater centralization at the federal level of state aid. And it would be odd if in Europe, where we have a well-established system of community control of state aid in the safe hands of Ben and his colleagues, we were to see a decentralization of that. So I think this shaking of the world overall landscape provides the opportunity for member states and the European institutions to reflect on their respective roles. And in some areas, not many, but in some areas, I believe the only way to respond vigorously and not as the weakest part of all the three to this US, China, EU dynamic is to have a bit more of central power in the EU. And this means that I'm afraid that I need to touch on this particular point, that the independence with which, not on paper, not just on paper, but in daily realities, the independence with which European institutions vested with the powers of enforcement, first of all the Commission and of course the Court, but the Commission in the areas of single market, competition, state aid, or the enforcement of whatever fiscal discipline rules will be soon decided upon. This independence has to be really very, very vigorous. We will not achieve what all member states say they want the EU to achieve, that is to be a stronger player in the global arena in terms of economy and security, unless they take seriously the consequences, that is
but we're running out of time, and I would like to maybe just ask if you could be very fast, Mr. Smulders, just to react on this and maybe tell us whether after the step, can we expect something broader, something bigger coming later. So a real European sovereignty fund. And there was also a question from the audience asking whether a cap on the price of electricity would have been a better solution, but that's probably not a question for you, but I still wanted to ask it.
I'm happy
and then
that I don't have to answer that last. Thank you very much. No, I don't have much to add. Fact of the matter is, the step is a step towards a sovereignty fund. Let's be clear. It's in no way a sovereignty fund yet.
Okay.
Secondly, it is in essence a reorientation of our existing EU funds towards promoting the certain strategic sectors. It goes beyond crisis management. That is also a problem, and Mr. Zulek referred to it. There are not enough EU funds. So last week, together with all these initiatives, the Commission asked, in the context of the midterm review of the multi-annual financial framework, for more funds, for more EU funds for this purpose. I think an amount of more than 10 billion euros was identified. Yep. We'll see how the European Council will react to that this week. But at the same time, as you know, EU funds are often matched by contributions by member states, and there a state aid element can occur, and the question then arises, how do you assess that? Because the purpose cannot be that through a certain mechanism there's a money laundering system to clean state aid, which otherwise we would not be able to approve. So the issue of how to align the rules for EU funding and state aid need to be looked at. An alignment, certainly in terms of process, is necessary. And in terms of substance, I very much hope that we and expect that we will remain faithful to the basic principles of state aid control.
Thank you very much. That's very clear. I'm really sorry we have to conclude. We have run out of time. I'm just asking you to please remain seated, because the next session, Unlocking Investment to Finance Europe's Competitiveness and Green Agenda, moderated by my colleague Isabella Kaminska, will start immediately. Thanks again to the speakers, and thanks to you for participating. Have a nice afternoon. Thank you. Thank you, and sorry for not asking more.